The poor orphan girl followed a white horse. What she found left the whole village in shock. Chapter 1. The Invisible Girl of Dust Creek. The scorching Arizona sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty streets of Dust Creek, a small frontier town where everyone knew everyone else's business, except when it came to Clara May Henderson. At 16, she moved through the settlement like a ghost, her worn calico dress patched so many times it resembled a patchwork quilt, her bare feet silent against the wooden boardwalks. Clara May had been living in the town's makeshift orphanage, really just Mrs. Abernathy's cramped back room, since she was 7 years old. Her parents had died in a wagon accident on their way to California, leaving her with nothing but a small locket and the faded memory of her mother's lullabies. Mrs. Abernathy, a stern widow who ran the general store, took her in more out of Christian duty than kindness. "That girl's got the devil's luck," old Jeremiah would mutter whenever Clara May passed by his barber shop. First her folks, then the Macready fire started right after she helped with their harvest. Mark my words, trouble follows that child. The townspeople's superstitions had created an invisible barrier around Clara May. She wasn't welcome at church socials, wasn't invited to barn raisings, and when she tried to help at the schoolhouse, parents would suddenly remember urgent errands that required their children's immediate attention. The only beings that seemed to accept her presence were the stray dogs that wandered Main Street and the wild horses that occasionally ventured close to town. Every morning before dawn, while Mrs. Abernathy still snored in her bedroom, Clara May would slip out to the edge of town where the desert met the grassland. There she would sit on a weathered boulder and watch the sunrise paint the mountains purple and gold. The animals seemed to sense her loneliness. Rabbits would graze nearby without fear, and sometimes a hawk would circle overhead, calling softly as if greeting an old friend. On this particular morning, as storm clouds gathered on the horizon, promising the first rain in months, Clara May noticed something unusual. Standing at the crest of a distant hill, silhouetted against the dark sky, was a horse unlike any she had ever seen. Its coat was pure white, almost luminescent in the pre-dawn light, and it stood perfectly still, as if waiting for something. "Well, I'll be," she whispered, rising slowly from her rock. "Where did you come from, beautiful?" As if hearing her words, the horse lifted its head and looked directly at her. For a moment that seemed to stretch like eternity, girl and horse regarded each other across the desert expanse. Then, with a graceful turn, the white horse began walking away from town, toward the badlands that most folks avoided. Clara May felt an inexplicable pull, as if an invisible rope connected her heart to this magnificent creature. Without thinking, she began to follow, her feet finding purchase on the rocky terrain with surprising ease. The horse maintained its distance, never too far ahead but never close enough to touch, leading her deeper into the wilderness than she had ever ventured. Behind them, Dust Creek began to stir with the sounds of morning, roosters crowing, dogs barking, the clatter of pots and pans as families prepared breakfast. But Clara May heard none of it. Her entire world had narrowed to the white horse, moving like a dream through the sagebrush and scattered Joshua trees. The storm clouds were moving in fast now, bringing with them the promise of a flash flood if the rain came too hard too quickly. Clara May knew she should turn back, knew that Mrs. Abernathy would notice her absence and add another chore to her endless list of punishments. But something about this moment felt different, important in a way she couldn't articulate. As thunder rumbled overhead and the first fat raindrops began to fall, the white horse led her toward a cluster of hills she had never noticed before, hills that seemed to shimmer and shift in the uncertain light. Whatever lay ahead, Clara May knew that this morning would change everything. The invisible girl of Dust Creek was about to become impossible to ignore. Duren see to Chapter 2, The White Horse's Secret Path. The rain began as scattered drops, but quickly intensified into a steady downpour that turned the desert dust into slippery mud. Clara May pulled her thin shawl over her head, but it provided little protection against the elements. Her worn boots squelched with each step, and rivulets of muddy water ran down her face, but she pressed on, mesmerized by the white horse that seemed unaffected by the storm. The terrain grew increasingly treacherous as they climbed higher into the hills. What had looked like gentle slopes from a distance revealed themselves to be steep, rocky paths carved by decades of flash floods. Clara May's hands were scraped raw from grabbing onto sage bushes and jagged stones to keep her balance, but the horse moved with supernatural grace, its hooves finding purchase where none seemed to exist. "Wait!" Clara May called out, her voice barely audible above the thunder. "Please, I can't keep up!" As if responding to her plea, the white horse paused on a narrow ledge and turned back to look at her. Its dark eyes seemed to hold an ancient intelligence, and for a moment Clara May could have sworn she saw something like compassion in its gaze. Then it nickered softly and continued forward, but at a slower pace that allowed her to follow more easily. They had been climbing for nearly 2 hours when Clara May began to recognize something familiar about their surroundings. The rock formations, the way certain boulders sat at odd angles, the stunted pine tree growing from what appeared to be solid stone. She had seen these things before, but where? Then it hit her like a bolt of lightning. These were the hills from her dreams, the recurring nightmares that had plagued her sleep since childhood. In those dreams, she was always searching for something lost, calling out for her parents in a place that felt both foreign and familiar. She had never understood why the same landscape appeared night after night in her unconscious mind. But now, standing in the very place she had only visited in sleep, a chill ran down her spine that had nothing to do with the rain. The white horse led her around a massive boulder that had split in half, revealing a narrow passage between the rocks. Clara May hesitated. The opening was barely wide enough for her slender frame, and beyond it lay only darkness. But the horse had already disappeared into the passage, and the sound of its hoofbeats echoing off stone walls compelled her forward. She squeezed through the opening, her clothes catching on the rough rock, and found herself in a hidden valley that defied explanation. Despite the storm raging overhead, the rain seemed to barely penetrate this sheltered space. Ancient cottonwood trees grew here, their massive trunks suggesting they had been thriving for decades, possibly centuries. A small stream ran through the center of the valley, fed by a natural spring that bubbled up from underground. But it was the structures that took her breath away. Scattered throughout the valley were the remains of buildings, not the crude wooden shacks that comprised most of Dust Creek, but substantial stone foundations and partially standing walls that spoke of permanence and prosperity. There were at least a dozen structures, some large enough to have been houses for entire families, others that looked like they might have been workshops or storage buildings. The white horse stood beside what appeared to have been the largest building, its walls still standing nearly 8 feet high in places. As Clara May approached, she could see that someone had taken great care in the construction. The stones were carefully fitted together, and iron hinges still hung from what had once been doorways. "This was a town," she whispered, her voice filled with wonder. A real town, not just a few buildings thrown together. She walked among the ruins, running her fingers along the smooth stone walls, trying to imagine what this place had looked like when it was alive with families and commerce. Unlike the hasty construction of most frontier settlements, everything here spoke of people who had planned to stay, who had built for generations yet to come. Near what might have been the town center, Clara May discovered something that made her heart race. Partially buried under decades of accumulated sand and debris was a wooden sign, its paint faded but still legible in places. She knelt down and carefully brushed away the dirt with her hands, revealing words that changed everything she thought she knew about her past. "Welcome to Henderson Valley, founded 1847. Henderson. Her family name. The name Mrs. Abernathy had told her meant nothing, that had been chosen at random from a list of unclaimed identities for orphaned children. But here was proof that the Hendersons had not only existed, they had been important enough to have an entire valley named after them. The white horse moved closer and gently nuzzled her shoulder, as if offering comfort. Clara May reached up to stroke its neck, and for the first time since her parents' death, she felt like she belonged somewhere. This place, these ruins, the very ground beneath her feet, somehow it was all connected to her. Thunder crashed overhead, reminding her that the storm was far from over and that she was miles from town with no one knowing where she had gone. But as she looked around the hidden valley that bore her family's name, Clara May realized that she had found something far more valuable than shelter from the rain. She had found the first piece of her true identity. Ndaji, Chapter 3, Buried Secrets and Hidden Truths. As the storm began to subside, Clara May explored the ruins with growing excitement and trepidation. The white horse followed her from structure to structure, almost like a guide showing her points of interest. In what appeared to have been a blacksmith shop, she found tools still hanging on rusted hooks. In another building, she discovered the remains of a printing press, its metal frame corroded but still recognizable. This had been no ordinary frontier settlement. The sophistication of the equipment, the quality of the construction, the carefully planned layout of the buildings, all of it suggested a community with resources and education far beyond what most people possessed in this harsh territory. Behind the largest structure, Clara May discovered something that made her pulse quicken: a family cemetery with weathered headstones arranged in neat rows. Many of the names had been worn away by decades of wind and rain, but as she moved from grave to grave, cleaning off accumulated dirt and sand, she began to see familiar names emerging from the stone. Henderson. Henderson. Oh my God. There, on a large headstone near the center of the cemetery, she found what she was looking for. Thomas Henderson, 1821-1871, beloved husband and father. And beside it, Margaret Henderson, 1825-1871, devoted wife and mother. But it was the smaller headstone next to them that brought tears to her eyes. Baby Sarah Henderson, 1870-1871, too pure for earth. Her grandparents, and an aunt she had never known existed, all buried here in this hidden valley that time seemed to have forgotten. But why had no one in Dust Creek ever mentioned this place? Why had Mrs. Abernathy insisted that the Henderson name meant nothing? As if sensing her confusion and growing anger, the white horse led her to one more location, a building set apart from the others, partially hidden by overgrown vegetation. When Clara May pushed aside the tangled vines and stepped inside, she discovered what appeared to be an office or study. A massive desk dominated the room, its drawers warped by years of moisture but still intact. In the largest drawer, wrapped in oiled cloth that had protected it from the elements, she found a collection of documents that would shake the foundations of everything she believed about her family and her town. The papers were legal documents, deeds, and correspondence dating back to the 1860s. As Clara May carefully unfolded each page, a story began to emerge that filled her with both pride and rage. Thomas Henderson, her grandfather, had been one of the original investors in the railroad that was supposed to run through this valley. He had used his family's savings and borrowed heavily to purchase the land and establish Henderson Valley as a way station and supply depot for the railroad workers. Other families had joined him, investing their life savings in what promised to be a prosperous future. But according to the documents, the railroad company had suddenly changed its route, choosing to run the tracks through what would become Dust Creek instead. The reason wasn't geographical or engineering related. It was financial. Someone had paid the railroad officials to redirect the route, ensuring that their own holdings would become valuable while leaving Henderson Valley to die. The name on the bribery documents made Clara May's hands shake with fury. Cornelius Abernathy, Mrs. Abernathy's late husband and Dust Creek's founding father. The documents revealed that Cornelius Abernathy had not only orchestrated the railroad's route change, but had also systematically bought up the Henderson Valley properties for pennies on the dollar as families went bankrupt and were forced to abandon their dreams. He had essentially stolen an entire town and the future of dozens of families. But there was more. Hidden in a secret compartment of the desk, Clara May found a small leather journal that appeared to be her grandfather's personal diary. The final entries, written in an increasingly shaky hand, told a story of desperation and betrayal. September 15th, 1871. Cornelius came by again today. Says he'll buy our land for $500. $500 for what we paid $5,000 to develop. Margaret is with child again, and the sickness is taking so many. We have no choice. Was September 20th, 1871. Margaret lost the baby. Little Sarah never had a chance in this dying place. The others are all gone now. We are the last family in Henderson Valley. October 1st, 1871. Margaret passed in her sleep. I think it was mercy. Tomorrow I ride to Dust Creek to sign the papers. Cornelius will have his victory, but someday the truth will come out. Someday someone will remember what he stole from us. Doodle, the final entry was barely legible. October 3rd, 1871. Cannot live with the shame. Margaret, Sarah, I am coming home. Clara May sank to her knees, clutching the journal to her chest. Her grandfather had died by his own hand, broken by Cornelius Abernathy's greed and the loss of everything he had worked to build. And somehow her own parents had survived, had escaped this place, only to die years later on their way to California, leaving their daughter to be raised by the widow of the man who had destroyed their family. The irony was so bitter, it made her feel sick. Mrs. Abernathy, who treated her like an unwanted burden, who reminded her daily that she was nothing but a charity case, was living off wealth that had been stolen from Clara May's own family. As the last of the storm clouds moved away and late afternoon sunlight slanted through the broken walls of the hidden valley, Clara May made a decision that would change everything. She carefully gathered the documents and the journal, wrapping them back in the oiled cloth. The white horse watched her with those intelligent eyes, as if understanding the magnitude of what she had discovered. "Thank you," she whispered, stroking the horse's neck one last time. "Thank you for showing me the truth." When she looked up again, the white horse was gone, vanished as mysteriously as it had appeared. But Clara May no longer needed a guide. She knew exactly where she needed to go and what she needed to do. The invisible orphan girl was about to become the most important person in Dust Creek, whether the town was ready for it or not. Chapter 4. The Truth That Shook Dust Creek. By the time Clara May made it back to town, the sun was setting, and most of the townsfolk were gathered at Murphy's saloon for their usual evening socializing. She was exhausted, muddy, and her clothes were torn from the journey through the hills, but her grip on the oiled cloth bundle never wavered. Mrs. Abernathy was waiting on the porch of the general store, her face twisted with anger. "Where have you been, you worthless girl?" she snapped. "I've had customers all day asking for things while you were off gallivanting in the desert like some wild animal." "Mrs. Abernathy," Clara May said quietly, her voice steadier than it had ever been, "I need to speak with you about your husband. My Cornelius has been dead for 3 years. What could you possibly—" "I know what he did." Clara May held up the bundle of documents. "I know about Henderson Valley. I know about my grandfather, Thomas Henderson, and how your husband stole everything from my family." Mrs. Abernathy's face went white, then red with rage. "You don't know what you're talking about, you foolish child. Making up stories about your betters. Mayor Patterson needs to see these documents," Clara May interrupted, her voice growing stronger. "The whole town needs to know the truth about how Dust Creek was really founded." Word of the confrontation spread quickly through the small town. By the time Clara May walked into Murphy's saloon, carrying her precious bundle, a crowd had already gathered. Mayor Patterson, a portly man who had always treated her with dismissive politeness, looked annoyed at having his evening interrupted. "Now, Clara May, Mrs. Abernathy says you've been making wild accusations about her late husband. That's a serious matter." "These aren't accusations," Clara May said, carefully unwrapping the documents on the largest table. "These are legal papers, deeds, contracts, letters, all proving that Cornelius Abernathy bribed railroad officials to change the route and then bought up Henderson Valley land for almost nothing after the families went bankrupt." The room fell silent as Clara May spread out the papers, pointing to signatures and dates. Dr. Morrison, who could read better than most, leaned in to examine the documents closely. "Good Lord," he whispered. "These appear to be authentic. Look at this, a letter from the railroad company acknowledging receipt of payment for route consultation services. And this deed shows the Henderson property being sold for $500 when the assessed value was over $5,000. "It's all lies," Mrs. Abernathy shrieked. "She forged those papers. That girl has always been trouble, always been jealous of decent folks." But as more people gathered around the table, as Dr. Morrison read aloud from the documents in his clear, educated voice, the mood in the saloon began to shift. Some of the older residents were nodding with recognition. "I remember now," said Martha Keene, the school teacher's widow. "My late husband used to talk about Henderson Valley. Said there was a settlement up in the hills that just disappeared one day. Always wondered what happened to those folks." "My pa mentioned it too," added young Samuel Wright. "Said the Henderson family had been good people, hard workers. Always thought it was strange that they just vanished like that." Mayor Patterson was studying the documents with growing unease. As the elected leader of Dust Creek, he had built his reputation on the town's founding story, how Cornelius Abernathy had been a visionary who recognized the potential of this location and convinced the railroad to come through here, bringing prosperity to the region. "Even if these documents are real," he said carefully, "this all happened decades ago. It doesn't change anything now." "It changes everything," Clara May said firmly. "It means this town was built on stolen land and broken dreams. It means the Abernathy family has been living off wealth that was taken from my family and others. And it means I'm not the nobody orphan everyone thinks I am. I'm the rightful heir to Henderson Valley and everything that was stolen from my grandfather." The room erupted in chaos. Some people were demanding to see more proof. Others were defending the Abernathy family's reputation, and still others were beginning to piece together implications that could affect property rights and business relationships throughout the town. But it was old Jeremiah, the barber who had always muttered about Clara May bringing bad luck, who spoke the words that silenced everyone. "The girl's right," he said quietly. "I was there when Cornelius made his first big land purchases back in '72. Always wondered how a man who arrived here with nothing could suddenly afford to buy up half the territory. Now I know." Over the following days, as word spread beyond Dust Creek to the territorial capital, investigators arrived to examine Clara May's documents. Everything she had discovered was verified by legal experts and historians. The scandal reached all the way to the railroad company headquarters, exposing a pattern of corruption that had affected multiple communities across the territory. Mrs. Abernathy, faced with overwhelming evidence and the possibility of criminal charges, agreed to a settlement that returned a significant portion of the stolen Henderson properties to Clara May. Other families who had been cheated were also compensated from the Abernathy estate. But the most profound change was in how the town viewed Clara May herself. The invisible orphan girl, who had been dismissed and avoided for years, was now recognized as a young woman of courage and determination who had exposed a decades-old injustice. People who had once crossed the street to avoid her now sought her out to offer apologies and assistance. On a warm morning 6 months after her discovery, Clara May stood in the ruins of Henderson Valley, watching as construction crews began rebuilding the settlement that her grandfather had dreamed of. The territorial government had agreed to fund the restoration as part of a broader effort to address historical injustices, and the railroad company was contributing significant resources to atone for their role in the corruption. As she watched the workers laying foundations for new buildings, Clara May thought she saw a flash of white on the distant hills, a horse moving gracefully across the landscape. She smiled and whispered a quiet thank you to whatever force had led her to the truth. The poor orphan girl who had followed a white horse had indeed left the whole village in shock. But more importantly, she had proven that even the most powerless person could change history when they had the courage to speak truth to power. In the rebuilt Henderson Valley, a bronze plaque would eventually commemorate not just the original settlement, but also the young woman who had refused to let its story be forgotten. And though Clara May never saw the white horse again, she knew it had served its purpose, leading her not just to buried treasure, but to the even more valuable discovery of her own strength and worth. The invisible girl had become impossible to ignore, and in doing so had reminded an entire community that justice delayed is not justice denied, as long as someone is brave enough to keep searching for the truth.